Hi everyone, my name is Jean Brundred. I'm an artist and I teach photography at the Michaelis School of Fine Art, University of Cape Town, South Africa. Myself and my colleague Svea Josephy are very excited to host today's talk with Jo Ractliffe. In a little bit about the Global Photographies Network before we begin. In 2020, as a response to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on students' learning, Sarah Pickering and Duncan Woodridge were concerned about developing a more transnational discussion around contemporary photography, photographic ideas, values, histories, and education. Too often, the global discussion around contemporary photography builds on a model of Western discourse around photography, with works from underrepresented photography cultures given exposure only to the degree that they conform to it. This network began in the UK with partners at Falmouth University, University of Westminster, Leeds Arts University, Slade School of Art, and the University of Arts London. And it has expanded to include organizations and universities in many countries, including my own, Gothenburg University, HDK Varland in Sweden, the Universidad de Palermo, Argentina, and organizations in Mexico, Taiwan, and Indonesia. Our audience today covers several continents. Hello. Our ambition as the Global Photographies Network expands is for a horizontal model of collaboration and a space where artists, photographers, writers, and curators can be given a large platform to present their work and where discussion and dialogue can be shared. A few things about the webinar. There's a Q&A, so you can please enter questions at any point in the webinar into the Q&A panel. And we will select questions that can be answered in the Q&A at the end of the talk. The talk will be recorded and will be available via your network organization with the agreement of the speaker. So without further ado, I'm really happy to introduce our speaker today, Jo Ractliffe. And we're zooming in from Cape Town, where it is a beautiful day. And she will deliver a talk titled Placing Pictures, Fragments, Essays, Assemblages in My Work. Jo Ractliffe is a photographer whose work has been mostly concerned with the ways in which histories of violence are manifest in the landscapes of the present. Examining photography's complex relationship to the real is a hallmark of her practice, and her interest in photography as an experience rather than simply an image has led her to produce works that explore photography's capacity to extend beyond the appearance of things to the ephemeral and unseen. In this talk, Jo will speak about her more recent work, which moves away from the extended photo essay and marks a return to her early interest in juxtaposition and montage. If you are in the UK, you can see her work at the Photographers Gallery in London, as she is one of the Deutsche Börse Photography Foundation Prize finalists for the year. Jo, over to you.
Right, so let me start. Oh, wait, no. Okay, so I'm here. Hello, thanks for having me. I'm feeling a bit intimidated. I see there are quite a lot of people. So, just firstly, I think if people want to interrupt me, I'm very happy to be interrupted. So I don't know, Jean, maybe if a question comes up and it's around what I'm talking, we don't necessarily have to wait to the end.
Sure.
I'm quite happy to start to be more conversational. What I have done is prepared a kind of slideshow to just, I really want to look at 3 projects that have happened since 2018. So 2018, 19 and last year. But I've got a few images that just track some of the early work. And really, I think what I'm going to be looking at is sort of two things. One is the notion of the fragment, which I think is present through every single body of work, albeit in manifestly different ways. And I mean, it's always interesting when you have moments to look back on work. And I've had a few of them recently where, you know, one was sort of convalescing after an injury, and during that time actually putting together a big book that was published by Steidl. So I had the opportunity to really look back through negative files that go back about 30 years. And I find it always interesting that you think you might be doing something new, and then you go back and you find 30 years ago you were grappling with that very same problem, albeit in a different way. So things that I've thought that I work very recently, that my work has been different, and I realize it's not. It goes right back to the kinds of things that I was battling with in the 80s, and there are various tracks of it. So the one is this idea of the fragment, and you know, that photography is in many ways, you know, really a fragmentary image making process. And then the other one is idea around narrative, and narrative in terms of sequence, evoking a story, telling a story, the non-story. So narrative might be spatial or time narratives, but where, you know, and it's linked to this idea of the fragment in the sense that these juxtapositions or sequences might expand the time frame of a single photograph, or might expand it spatially. So it's also around sort of pushing against the edges of that frame. So should I see if I can now share my screen?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so and then I do, what was it? Sorry.
Command L.
Okay. Okay. And then just stop me, because I'm feeling now very particularly disembodied. I feel like I'm in a sort of tunnel. Okay, so these three works, they're a triptych. They were made in the sort of mid-late 1980s. The series was called Nada. And they really came out of a very intense frustration at that time with my own work, which seemed unable to evoke the kind of, you know, madness of that time in South Africa. You know, I was working largely outside in the landscape. I wasn't really cut out to be a social documentary photographer, which was very much the dominant mode. And I wanted to find a way of expressing my response to the time. So these are cut and paste photo montages, pre-digital era, made on line film. So that's you know, it's effectively, it's not a continuous tone, it's a half-tone screen film. And these were sort of put together, printed photographically through on a litho plate, and then this kind of color and tone was added through screen printing. So it really took me into printmaking and very far away from photography, but it meant that I could gather images from quite disparate sources and make images that felt much closer, you know, and felt more expressive, really. So these images come from waste dumps around Cape Town, townships and resettlement camps, junkyards. Initially, I found dogs, and I think we come to an image later on, which is an early image of when I was photographing in the township of Crossroads, when during a state of emergency in the mid-1980s and police bulldozers were leveling the township. And then, so dogs became a kind of protagonist in this narrative. And in this body of work, there are about 18 images. And some of the dogs are found dogs, you know, dogs that I've found on the streets, and I would photograph and document them. Other dogs were, like these two dogs imaged here, belong to my sister, and they are just at play in her backyard. And that rearing dog with the teeth is actually a puppy. But I was just lying on the ground photographing upwards. And then I also went to police dog training sessions and had the policemen set their dogs on me so I could photograph up close and in some of these intensely violent scenes. And I was looking at that time, there were two books in particular. One was Ryszard Kapuscinski's book, Another Day of Life. He's a Polish journalist who was chronicling the end of the Portuguese occupation of Angola, or the end of that colonial process, the beginning of Angola's independence, and which really merged into a civil war. And I read it in the 1980s, and it seemed very similar to what was happening in South Africa at the time. And there's this fantastic passage. I've recounted the story many times, but this passage of the dogs left behind by the Portuguese. And the other book was Ridley Walker, a kind of post-apocalyptic narrative by the writer Russell Hoban, who was American. I'm trying to work out whether he was born in America but lived in the UK or the other way around. But it is the most fantastic story. And this young man, Ridley Walker, and his travels to Canterbury in this, very sort of, a post-apocalyptic era. So this body of work very much became a kind of narrative through this landscape of ruin and violence. And dogs are both, because they're such a fantastic, it seemed to be a very common trope in South Africa at that time. And I think if you look at photography during the American Civil Rights period as well, this idea of dogs that become violent, police dogs. But yes, we have this idea of dogs as being man's best friend and all of that. So that's one mode of this, really this way of looking at montage. This is a body of work that followed in it began in 1990, and I worked in this for the 5 years between 1990, the release of Mandela, and up to the first democratic election. And, as much as I'm locating these works in some kind of political moment, my work doesn't begin with that as an intention, although, very much in South Africa, and particularly during the 80s and early 90s, I can't think of an artist whose work didn't engage in that moment. It was a very, compelling, it was almost the prerogative of artists was to engage what was happening. But there seemed to be a kind of synchronicity between something that would happen with me photographically, like a dissatisfaction with the way that I was working, or a question about photography and a lack that was in my work. It's always propelled in that way. It's a kind of something of my desire for photographs to be put to work in a particular way, and their refusal to do so, certainly in my work. And in 1990, I'd gone, I'd always wanted to work with straight photography and be a proper photographer. So after these photo montages of the NADA, I thought, I don't want to work in that way. I want to work back with photography. So I started working, let's say straight, we'll just use that word, working with straight, uncut up, unmanipulated in that way. But as it happened, I had a burglary and all my cameras were stolen. And all I had was this big collection of toy cameras that I'd been assembling over the years, one of which was a Diana. And so I started working with the Diana initially, just as a way to continue working until I replaced all my equipment. And ironically, it was very, very difficult to work with a cheap plastic camera that had fixed focus, no exposure controls, terrible negatives. But I had to really reframe my way of seeing. I almost had to learn this kind of way of seeing where you're seeing out of the edges of your vision, almost as if you're leaving something and moving somewhere else. Some of my early photographs, if I was looking in the same way that I'd been, and I've worked mainly with medium format cameras. I'd worked with a Mamiya twin lens and a 645 up till that point. And this neat square frame just didn't work. My early pictures with the Diana were terrible. But and these images were largely made up of long extended drives and various road trips across the country through the Karoo. And there was something very interesting happening in that moment in photography in a more broader local idea, this transition to democracy. I mean, it was a very violent time. And in the first couple of years leading up to the first democratic elections, the country was beset by all sorts of interests in derailing the democratic process. And photography or photographers were thrown into also a difficult moment where the ways of working in the 80s, which very much focused on a kind of, when I say spectacular, I'm talking about an event, whether it's a funeral or a march or police brutality. So there was a very, there was an immediate, the subject, whatever it was, really did the work. And the idea of photography as that kind of transparent notion of, exposure of what was happening during apartheid. So there wasn't a huge amount of discourse that looked at issues around subject position or who was representing or what, or point of view. And those things were sort of put aside in favor of more pressing imperatives, which was really to get the images out of what was happening. But when I was working with these Dianas, I mean, I'd had some, I was thinking of film stills, this kind of, and the way that film stills seem to, photographs often sort of contain the world within a frame. It's almost like they organize the world. And so there's this idea that that frame is complete. Film stills are almost the opposite. They manifestly are unhinged and are the moment in between sequences. And so I was thinking of that. I was thinking also of home movies. And I think partly it was this mode with these darkened edges and things. But there was something also, literally these pictures were dark because they have this vignetted edge. And there was something about these fragments that didn't kind of cohere into the kinds of images we were used to in the 80s that were predicated on clarity, black and white, a very recognizable subject or event. So these were sort of murky and indecisive, but they felt appropriate to me in the way that that was a time where actually people were rethinking the historical narratives. They were rethinking, who they were, what was our place in this. So, the past literally became murky. It was clear that the past was not what it had been said it was, if that's a way of putting it. So, and this is just an installation shot from that. So these images are, they're suspended back to back. So on the back of all of these are mirror images. So there were 50 in total. And so you would walk through, there were the walls. And there was something that happened quite by accident, but that really, was very nice in the way that the reflectiveness of the glass, images on the back sort of almost, they reflected each other. So at certain points, that whole installation, which was really heavy glass, looked quite ephemeral and transparent. And so at times when you were at a distance, an image looked to be one thing, but when you got up close, you could actually see the image and not its reflection. So there was something quite interesting that happened there. And then I became a bit of a, plastic camera junkie, which, and with these moments of return to straight photography and projects in between. And there was another project that I'll talk about later called End of Time, but I'm using it in, I'll talk about it in another body of work. But so, yeah, so I sort of seem, you know, have moved between these modes of working where I can expand the frame in camera in various ways, or through juxtaposition, or through, you know, sort of photo montage, actual collage. These are two series that I did in the early 2000s and began, this is from a body of work called Port of Entry, which was one long strip that ran, there were 20, it was a work that was 20 meters long and it was 20 centimeters high. And these were made with a Holga camera. And I found that the little framing device, there's a little plastic plate on the back of that camera that you could pull off, and that could be removed. And so I could work in sequence. Hang on, let me just keep a check on time because I don't want to spend. Jean, when should I be stopping?
Somewhere around in about 20 minutes.
Okay. All right, let me move through these quickly. So these were working with, you know, there were city environments. This is a series on Johannesburg as well. So with that framing device removed, I could shoot an entire roll of film. And so these were kind of then stripped together and again, suspended. This was a project at the Joburg Art Gallery with a friend of mine, Terry Kurgan. And it was really looking at Johannesburg, the city. And then things shifted, and I in 2006, I started a sort of body of work that went on in 2007, actually. But this was, I'd started working, you know, I decided in 2006, I'd built a studio, I'd built a darkroom at home, and I just wanted to get back into the darkroom in black and white. I was tired, you know, suddenly there was the Lomo craze, and I just thought, okay, end, you know, this is all has to come to an end. And I also bought a new Mamiya 6x7, and in 2007 I started working in Angola, looking at the aftermath of the Civil War. And also, I won't go into all of the history, but, you know, Angola Civil War, which really started in 1975 at the moment of independence, you know, was also a kind of, well, was, you know, there were layers to this war. It was also a kind of proxy Cold War with Russia and the States backing to the two liberation movements who were in dispute and in conflict. And at the time, South Africa had its own interests really in Namibia, where it had, you know, it had been given sort of custodianship of Namibia since the, I don't know, since the end of the First World War, and treated Namibia like an extended province. And with the sort of mounting anti-apartheid struggle, the ANC had moved into exile, but also the Namibian liberation movement, which South Africa was intent on squashing, had moved into exile in Angola. You know, so with the advent of a Marxist government in Angola, you know, these struggle movements had refuge. So in South Africa, this was known as the border war, but it was actually a secret war that was fought against Namibia, but in Angola. And this was manifest in 3 projects. The first one was called Terreno Occupado, which means occupied land, which really looked at the capital, Luanda, which a few years after the end of the Civil War. And then the second project, these 2 photographs come from the second project, was called As Terras do Fim do Mundo, which means the lands at the end of the world, where for 2 years I traveled with veterans, soldiers, mainly South African, but in one instance, Angolan, and in another instance, Namibian, through the battlefields of southern Angola, largely minefields. And really looking at, I was very interested in, I mean, there are a whole lot of other projects that I've left out that look at the ways in which violence is, you know, violence of the past is manifest in the landscape of the present, and how how to find ways to speak when the traces of that violence are not always manifest. So in places like, I mean, there are works in South Africa, Vlakplaas is one of them, which was the sort of headquarters of a very notorious, basically an apartheid death squad. And there are various works that I've done over the last, 40 years. But this is a kind of good example of that, where there is nothing to see, but what is underneath this landscape are landmines. I mean, these were all resulted in exhibitions and books. And this was when I really started thinking of the book in a different way, the book as the kind of carrier of a kind of sequence or the extended photo essay. So I stopped thinking about bodies of work now, which were made up of these fragments, and I started thinking of the photo book and essays. But also, now, I mean, I can remember after I'd done the first two books and I was, quite pleased with these projects, I was in Kassel for the photo book festival and listened to a talk by Ramon Reverte, who runs RM Books. He's the publisher at RM, and he did a talk on the Latin American photo book, which just blew my head wide open. And I realized actually I'd been making monographs and not photo books at all. So that became a new sort of quest, as it were. So again, so these are really, and I suppose with these books, especially with this book, where the images here are dependent on the accrual of a certain kind of repetition for them to gain meaning, because there are these, landscape after landscape after landscape of seemingly nothing, tiny little details. You might find some objects or some structures, but they really, it's only in their totality as this extended essay there's one image of a person in this body of work, and it's a D minor, and he's almost like a kind of Bart punctum in the middle of the photo essay, where suddenly landscapes sort of resolve into a different kind of reading by virtue of that photograph, where you might rethink what it is that you were looking at. This is the third in the trilogy, and it's called The Borderlands. And it was really, I was wanting to look at sites back in South Africa that had been harnessed to the war. And, during the 1980s, during the state of emergency, and when the border war was really in full tilt, and it was only really acknowledged in 85 by the South African government, there were troops in the townships. There were police presence. The police were coming up onto campus at the university. And obviously now in 2010, there's no trace of that. So I was trying to think of how, and it was a comment that a colonel had said whilst we were in Angola. He said, if you're going to have a war, best to have it in someone else's country and not with your own people, which, said just an enormous amount about how South Africa conducted that war. And I was curious about these temporary sort of military bases that were dotted around the kind of the borderlands. And so the project became the Borderlands. And once I started working, what was very curious, I eventually settled on 3 sites. One which was outside Kimberley, all in the Northern Cape. Another one right in the north. This one is Rimfasmark, which is right on the border of South Africa and Namibia. And then there was another one in Pomfret, which is also right on the northern border near Botswana. They all were previous sites of forced removals when apartheid government had decided to claim, designate homelands for Black people and remove them from, the lands of their birth and their forefathers. So, and some of them were very violent, like the forced removals here in Rimfasmark were really extreme. But again, here, this triptych isn't really a kind of panorama in space. You can see I'm moving around the group. Largely, I'm sort of outside. The first image is the group is arriving. This is a week before a wedding. It's a ceremony which was called raising the flag, and the group are coming from the bride's house to the groom's house, and there is, you know, there is the kind of ceremonial sacrifice of an animal, but I do not witness that event. So I'm behind the group and then I'm sort of inside the group. So it expands both space and time. So not all my photographs were like that, but a lot of my work, works with these sometimes placing images together. So the idea of the single frame is somewhat incomplete. And whether there are lots of diptychs and triptychs, there are also this idea of the body. So now it all changes. So, and this project or this exhibition marked really a kind of, for me, what felt like to me a radical rethinking. It paralleled a time I'd had an injury and, was busy convalescing from this injury and was invited onto this exhibition in Mexico, in Oaxaca. And it was a solo show at the Center of Photography, the Alvarez Bravo Center of Photography in Oaxaca, but it formed part of a larger project called Hace Noche, Crossing Night, which really looked at things around death and the afterlife. Those sometimes that sort of passage between the idea of, being dead, being alive, and, the rituals and practices around those transitions. And the two curators, Francisco Bazunza, who was Mexican, and South African Josh Ginsberg, had an idea of work that they wanted to include. And I didn't really want to do that. I didn't want to just take a body of work and transplant it in Mexico. And years ago, and in fact, it's the only image that I've ever bought. I bought this photograph, which was a photograph of Alvarez Bravo taken in 1934. One of his most political images, and even its title, has its, striking worker assassinated. And if you look at his titles, often they're kind of poetic and allegorical. This was really a sort of a very documentary title. And I remember when I first looked at this photograph, there was something, I was horrified and transfixed by the violence and the beauty, that something so violent could also be, so beautiful. And I bought this photograph. It took me a year to pay it off, but I had this photograph. And so in thinking around this show, I thought, what would happen if I started looking through my own work for individual images that spoke to some of the themes of the show, and impertinently thinking, well, partly because it was at his museum and that I owned this photograph, that I might use that image as a way to start a kind of process of looking at my own images. And so what was radical for me in this project was it meant disrupting my bodies of work, and sort of taking images that had been made for a specific intention, whether it's the war in Angola, or whether it's this the death of a donkey on the side of the road in the Karoo, or so, with very different intentions, and now putting them to work in a different kind of assemblage. And assemblage was the word this friend of mine, Daniela Montelongo, who I met at this time in Mexico, had used. So I'm just going to show a couple of the images, and it started with a kind of free association from that image working outwards. So this photograph on the computer screen is also one from the Shooting Diana, the Diana camera, the toy camera images. This image was taken in 1999, and it became a very large project that Jean worked with me on in the middle of the Karoo, which is this large expanse of sort of semi-desert scrubland and, tiny little small towns. And there is a group known as the Karakimense, cart people in translation, which are arguably South Africa's most itinerant group of people, and who move from farm to farm seeking workers, sheep shearers. I was driving to Cape Town and had come across this shooting, and it felt like the most insidious articulation of violence, of shooting donkeys, which effectively destroys a family's livelihood, mode of transport, all of that. But so I was looking, and this is a photograph for Angola. It's at a roadside stall, it's men's overalls, but it's an image that always reminded me partly of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, We Are the Hollow Men. And I always thought of this as an image of ghosts. Also an image of, you know, it has echoes of those photographs of lynchings in the American Deep South, but it felt as a way to speak about the fact that half of Angola's population now, after the war, is under 18. So a kind of generation of men who'd been killed in the war. This is also in Angola, another in Angola. So these are, and this is from 86 in township, in Crossroads Township outside Cape Town during the state of emergency. And this is now 2013 in Rimfasmark, and it's a man, Piet Besson, who had been forcibly removed from the area holding his Bible. So it was, and the little picture on the advertising the talk is taken from this project. And so really what it was, you know, printing up all of these images and working with a kind of free association and finding a way of putting narrative together in that space. But what was really interesting for me, because it wasn't just about taking images and reassembling them. For me, what felt so radical, it's you are reascribing intention in a way. So, and I entered into a very, very different relationship with my photographs, because somehow, you know, the relationship had been with projects or bodies, you know, the images of Angola or the images of the Karoo or the images from shooting Diana, that kind of road trip. And suddenly here there were individual images that kind of would press up against each other. I could, you know, jostle with each other. And I mean, they became, for me, quite animated. There were certain images that I sometimes, you know, would pop up and I wouldn't really know how to configure them, but they kind of refused to be thrown away. I had these endless maybe piles, you know, the in, out, and maybe, you know, as we got put together the exhibition. But the maybe pile was the most kind of dynamic pile. And on one level, it was quite liberating, because it made me think that photographs do have their own force. You know, they're not inert. They're not simply these spaces that we project onto. But there was something, I just made a note. Oh, it was something that at this point when I met Daniela in Mexico, and she had spoken about when she first encountered some of the images of Angola, she said they felt deeply familiar. And then she realized that actually they weren't familiar because she recognized geography or scrub or whatever, but she recognized a certain kind of way of seeing violence in the landscape that felt her familiarity was the way hidden violence is inscribed in the landscape in Mexico. So there was a kind of an affinity. And so this sparked a conversation that we have had over a period of years. But I'm just trying, I've made some points about, yeah, so ways of thinking. And one of the things that she was saying, it's almost, instead of working with these sequences or juxtapositions, it's almost like, she used the word assemblage or assemblage, because it's almost like one image produces this kind of constellation of images that then look and argue for a place, which really is something that came into, this was the project that followed Mexico and was here in Cape Town in 2019, and was where I felt that I sort of had permission to go back into negative files and extract photographs, which, it also was a conversation I'd had with a friend and colleague, Rory Bester, who used to head up the History of Art department at WITS and now is at UWC, where he said, like with the body of work, when you are in Angola, I mean, in total, I mean, I don't know how many thousands of images, of negatives. And in the end, they're probably 150, Asteras has about 50 images, Terreno has 50, Borderlands has 100. So you're taking 200 images out of a possible 5,000. What happens to the leftovers? And I always felt that, that's what they have to stay there. But then I felt liberated to use them. And also because these days I work much more slowly. I'm not working in, well, not much more slowly, but because I've always worked slowly, but I'm not working with this expanded, extended project that used to take, 2 to 3 years to build. So Signs of Life also came around this idea of, I'd started these little spurts of really wondering where I would go next. Just before my injury, I'd started working in the Kruger National Park and was looking at the militarization of conservation, but then that project got abandoned. So I had various kind of leftovers, and then these odd things that I was starting to photograph, but didn't have, nothing had coalesced into an intention for a body of work. And so this is one, which was just a drive up the west coast in St. Helena Bay, and this mermaid, which reminded me very much of a Pablo Neruda poem about this woman who sits at the edge of the sea. This was a photograph taken in Mexico. And here, I suppose what I want to say with Signs of Life, I thought, how do I put back these very disparate images together? But so part of Signs of Life was, I mean, I've held it together with this, continued this thematic of things not being quite dead, but not quite alive. And often dead things become very animated, like this forlorn, poor figure without a face in this image. And then images that seem to border on a kind of otherworldly, or in these kinds of groupings can take on something otherworldly. This comes from the Kruger National Park. So if I think of these things around landscape or violence, it might have one kind of meaning. In relation to these other images that seem somehow heightened out of the ordinary, in juxtaposition, they carry a different kind of weight, and how they're pushed together is not this kind of flow of a kind of sequence or an essay, but rather this kind of, it's a more jagged, I mean, that's the word that comes into my head. It's a more disrupted, jagged, non-narrative, but a kind of reading. So, and they're photographs that, such as this one, that go back to the mid-80s. This was in Mexico, False Illusion. And this is also in Mexico, but it's a kind of homage to Graciela Iturbide. She always used to do, she's got these little self-portraits with these birds. And this is of a friend of mine, Penny Siopis, the artist, lying on top of one of her paintings with flowers in her eyes. And it was a kind of proxy self-portrait and homage to Graciela. And this is a photograph also from the 80s, which was really when I was looking for material for those photo montages of those dogs, and this was in the SA Museum. This is just south of Cape Town. This was after the ceremony of the Day of the Dead, the procession in Mexico. So it's kind of these random, well, not, or seemingly random, but images that put together that really kind of have a, create a kind of, there's some other kind of narrative, which is maybe not a linear narrative, not a kind of sequence or story. But that allowed me to sort of, in some senses, break away from this idea of all photographs, a kind of coherent intention behind every image in a body of work, that you could have photographs. And it was really a shift from this idea of a collective to an individual, this collective body of work that makes up meaning to an individual. Okay, can you give me 5 minutes? Because this is the last project and where this goes. And this image is an image taken off a TV screen in the mid-1980s. And I don't know why I do this every now and again. Every couple of years, for some unknown reason, I sort of photograph something off a television screen. And I included that in this. So there's also different ways of looking. But then being there, it brings to this project, which is now my proper photo book project. Although it didn't start out that way either. Being there came out of a question pre-COVID that really relates to my injury, which was, how do you photograph if you can't be in place? So if your capacity to move or be in the landscape, you know, or to be in the place where you photograph, how do you work? You know, because photography is predicated on you being there. And of course, this question became a very ordinary question faced by everybody during COVID. And like so many people, I was glued to my screen looking at footage, whether it was the fires in Australia or, you know, Me Too marches or the storming of the Capitol, or, you know, the whole world seemed to be contained within my screen. And then I thought, the screen's my portal. I can be in any place, in any time, anywhere. And so I started photographing off the screen, and not with screen grabs. I actually laboriously set up my camera with film in front of my monitor and watched films, whether they were documentaries. This is on the cover of the little photo book, which is someone doing an eye test, and it comes from one of the documentaries by Adam Curtis, Can't Get You Out of My Head. And some of them are from fiction films. So this is just the layout. So I photographed the whole way through lockdown. And, you know, if I just look at this pile, you know, top left, that sort of statue, that comes from a documentary on Vietnam. Next to it, that person carrying another person on their back is a Wim Wenders film. Just below that, that figure rolling on the ground comes from a Tarantino. What was it? It was the Revenge Western. I've forgotten the title now. It'll come back to me. And then just below that, those two images are documentaries on the atom bomb. Below that, that deer with the hand comes from Jim Jarmusch's Dead Man. Next to that, that strange hand holding the mask of a gorilla comes from a documentary on the Natural History Museum in New York. And next to that, that little fox walking through the landscape is a documentary on Chernobyl. So there were documentaries on the refugee crisis. They were all jumbled up. And then they were put in sequence. And so really it was, I became a thief. I stole images from other people's films. Some of them were YouTube videos. Some of them, there are about a third of the work comes from my own photographs. The very bottom right-hand corner, that hyena comes from an 80s photograph in the Natural History Museum in Cape Town. But I wanted to put them together to have a kind of narrative of what that time of the pandemic, this kind of disaster moment, this moment, and also B-rate horror movies. There are quite a few, and there will be some that we get to. And at the same time, I started going back into notebooks, looking at various texts. You know, when I read something interesting, I will write it out. And often it's from poetry or fiction, literature. And I started taking a sentence, and then there would be a sentence strung. So a kind of, if you know the writing of William Burroughs, you know, he favored a mode of writing called cut-ups, and he talks about this random collision of fragments. It's very similar to the way the filmmaker Eisenstein worked with juxtaposition, where he talks about the third meaning, where this collision of two sequences gives rise to an independent and third meaning. I'm talking very quickly now because I'm trying to race against time. So what I'll do now is just go through the pages in the book, and I'll keep quiet. So I haven't included every page, and you can see it's almost like a continuous scroll. So the images, you know, sometimes start at the end of the page. These little return signs sort of mark the difference between each writer. And within that text, there are quite a lot of texts which are about storytelling and narrative, and also about looking and about photography. So it reflects back on itself. As well as offering up, you know, a story for the viewer or the reader, you know, to make up. Yeah, this comes from a 50s horror movie, The Last Man Alive, which was then remade into that Will Smith film, I Am Legend, but this is from the original. Fantastic film. And that's it.
Jo, thank you very much. We have a question, and I think, let me put it to you straight away. It is about your choice to continue to use black and white film and not color or digital. So what attracts you to using black and white film?
Well, I mean, I think I'd worked all the way through the 80s in black and white. I mean, I'd done this little moment where we all learned to print Cibachrome at art school. So there was this little foray into color. But I guess black and white was the kind of standard way of learning. And you know, it was the kind of mode or the convention of documentary, which was really what we were all trained in here. And it was also that idea of craft. In the 90s, when I went a bit crazy with toy cameras, I also started working quite from sort of the mid 90s to 2005. I worked in both. I worked in, and it was really, I've also made a few videos. So it was really quite exploratory that time. I'd worked a lot in color, almost exclusively in color from 2000 to 2005. But my return to black and white was really wanting also to return to regain some kind of control over my process. And I think partly it was because there were very few outlets that printed color. You know, there were basically two people in South Africa who would print digital inkjet, 2 or 3. There were issues around quality and permanence and, you know, relying on someone else to image. I'd also had an issue. It's a thing around photography as light as opposed to photography as ink. I can't get my head around ink and photography. So it was a huge resistance to that. But it was also the joy of having a dark room and going back. And so for all the way through those Angola works, when I look back at it, I was mad. You know, you're traveling through Angola for 6 weeks at a time shooting, and then you're going to go back in another, you know, and you're bringing back, you know, sort of 100 rolls of film. and then processing and printing like mad, and then just going back in again. But I'm slow. I'm a slow looker. You know, I can work very quickly. I can put things together very quickly if I have to. But I also, you know, in that thing of this kind of slow accrual. This last project was just a year, so it was relatively quick. Digital, it's because I'm a complete technophobe. I'm just dumb when it comes to that. And you can ask Jean. I mean, I'm a good printer, and and I can photograph out in the landscape, but stick me in a studio, give me too many lenses. You know, I'm not a good photographer in that sense. I'm quite good with mechanics. I'm not good with maths and science. I know that's an odd question, but I think there's something that I love the theatricality of black and white. Certainly with Angola, it felt that I needed to acknowledge the history. And in fact, the reason why, particularly why I worked with black and white with the Angola series and not color, was because I wanted to avoid the way color speaks aesthetically and politically. So if you look at images of Africa through the 60s and 70s, it's all that Kodak red hue. Suddenly in the 2000s, Africa is not bright and colorful anymore. It's all desaturated. So you look at all the photography that comes out of Africa, it's all totally desaturated. And there's something about that look of Africa, and I wanted to get away from that. Also, because working particularly in the second project in Angola, where you are traveling through landscape and looking at things that you don't know whether are there from a week ago, 5 years ago, or 27 years ago. You know, time literally is collapsed in some of those places, and you are literally without language. You know, you cannot read that landscape. And I wanted not that ahistorical or dehistoricization so much as just that very stark looking at that kind of textural, graphic. You know, it also, if there's not a lot of stuff in your pictures, you know, I have to rely on a lot on surface. I know people don't think photography is material, but there's a kind of surface material quality. It's also the way quite often in those pictures, I mean, if you look at the original photographs, I work with quite a compressed tonal register. There's never a solid black or really sort of blown out stark white. There's, you know, these images often there'll be a full range, but they have this kind of a particular kind of quality. So there's something about that, and I can control that in a darkroom. Of course, all of these photographs in this project were, you know, they were literally scanned on my A4 scanner. You can see the pixelation, and because of that, I printed them on a German etching paper. So they are actually inkjets, but they have a much more sort of print quality. They didn't look so good printed as photographs. Anyway.
Thanks, Jo. I think, you know, we are past 4 o'clock our time, and I think some people would have to leave soon, but I want to ask you another question, and that is from Sarah Pickering, who is one of our partners.
Oh.
What she says, fantastic talk, Jo. I'm watching it on the move. I can see a really interesting connection between the TV shots and the Alvarez Bravo print you bought. In a way, the appropriation of those images could have been a strategy for making use of that print. I'm curious as to why you felt that you needed to buy it rather than just use it as source material or research as print in a book. Would you still buy it today, or has your approach shifted?
So, you know, I bought it because it was coming up on an auction, and it was a wild moment. And just, I mean, he is my, you know, he just is everything that I would like. You know, there's something about his poetic expressiveness. He manages to do things in photography that I've always wanted to do, and which I think I poorly lack. I think you know, and working, he was pivotal in that project in Mexico, where I actually discovered my photographs are not just empty landscapes. If I look at that body of work of Hey Tiempo, No Hay Tiempo, which actually comes from a sign that was in his studio, there is time, there is time. I saw that my images are a lot more dynamic than just blank, empty landscapes, as a friend of mine once called them in the 80s, quite rudely. And so it's allowed me to shift my looking and my way of seeing things. I mean, that mermaid photograph, and in fact, that funny thing of those two flowers in that bark, which is just a mad picture, I would never have taken before, because they're not hinged to anything. And I think what was wonderful about, I hadn't thought of him in relation to this project in being there, but I think what, you know, these are not just the accepted screens, you know, so these are, when I say I'm appropriating other people's images, obviously there's a translation of color to black and white, and I'm ratcheting up. I was thinking quite a bit of Daido Moriyama when I was making these. I really wanted to make them very graphic and quite extreme in their light dark, which is very not Alvaro's Bravo in a way. He also has this very muted kind of palette of grays. But I also reframed them. You know, I would go in and crop and isolate things out of the frame. So, I mean, some people have recognized, the only photographs that anyone has recognized in this project are two photographs from a Wim Wenders movie. Otherwise, no one has recognized a single image from a fiction film, and the documentaries you wouldn't recognize anywhere. But I think, I don't know if I'd buy the Alvaro's Bravo now. I love it. And I do love, I like having it. I'm a bit, you know, I mean, I'm not acquisitive in that sense, but there's something about, I remember when I got it, I was quite disappointed in the print quality. I thought, oh, he printed very flat. And David Goldblatt, who has one of his as well, came for supper that night and brought his. And we spent the entire night having supper, just looking at our two prints at the end of the table. And then a collector from Mexico came, looked at the print, said, oh no, it's definitely his printing, because he did print like that. So there is something about having that object. It's like a kind of talisman, I think.
Jo, we have gone over time. So I want to just thank you so much for sharing the insight into your working process. And maybe if you could, if you want to just say something briefly about your show at the Photographers Gallery to finish off. Okay, thanks. I mean, this has been fantastic. I hope it's been interesting for everyone else. So the show at the Photographers Gallery, you get nominated on the basis of an exhibition or a book in the previous year. And I was nominated on the basis of this title book, which really encompasses the earliest work in that book, I think, is early 1980s, right up until 2019. So it's kind of 40 odd years. So it was very difficult to find a way to consolidate that book into a show and to make a coherent show that didn't look like a sort of cut and paste from every project. And I thought one of the most, if you had to think of what is the enduring interest in my work, it is around landscape, and it is around this life, death, violence. So I took bodies of work that spoke to that. And I mean, once it went up, I started second guessing myself. I thought it was a little bit too equivalent, and I thought that I would have liked more images from Shooting Diana, or included the image from Vlakplaas, things that would disrupt. So it is all black and white, and it makes me look very documentary in that sense of, because everything's documentary in some ways. I mean, but it has a certain, I mean, in the review, Shauna Hagan said her most obvious predecessor is David Goldblatt. And I thought, God, David Goldblatt would be just turning in his grave, thinking of that, because we used to argue all the time. And I wrote to Brenda, his daughter, and said, your father would be dying. And she said, are there captions below the works? I said, yes. So she said, then he would forgive you, because that was another thing that we would argue with. So it really is, it includes work from the mid-80s right until 2018. But with that kind of thematic, yeah. Great. I'm sorry I'm not going to be able to see it. But yeah, all the best for holding thumbs for you for the announcement, which is happening shortly. So once again, thank you very much, Jo.
Thank you.
Duncan, is there anything you would like to say? Come in here, or shall we just end the session?
No, I think just to say thank you. That was a great talk. It was such a pleasure to hear you talk about your practice and your approach. So thanks very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Jo.
Yeah. So now what do we do? Do we head off somewhere else?
Yes, now we leave this. Rashi, are you going to leave it for us? Or end